At 4:23 a.m. on April 24, 1915, Corporal Francis Pegahmagabow pressed his eye against a battered butter churn mounted on two sticks, watching 8 German soldiers creep through the pre-dawn mist toward the Canadian trench line at Ypres. They were 70 yards out, knife range by the standards of the Western Front, where most men died without ever seeing who killed them. His finger rested on the trigger of his Ross rifle, but he didn't fire. Not yet. Through the circular hole he'd cut in the wooden churn's bottom, lined with a fragment of mirror salvaged from a farmhouse, he could see them clearly while remaining completely invisible below the parapet. They thought they were approaching an unmanned section of trench. They were wrong. This moment mattered because it represented everything the British Army's manual infantry training 1914 said couldn't be done. According to official doctrine, observation of no man's land required either exposing your head above the trench, which got you shot, or using the Army's approved brass periscopes, which reflected sunlight and drew sniper fire like moths to flame. The manual explicitly forbade improvised observation devices constructed from salvaged materials on the grounds that they were unreliable and unmilitary. Pegahmagabow, an Ojibwe hunter from the Parry Island Reserve in Ontario, was about to prove that the British Army understood less about staying invisible than a man who'd spent his childhood tracking deer through Georgian Bay's forests. What he was attempting wasn't just forbidden, it was considered impossible by the officers who'd studied warfare at Sandhurst and written the field manuals. He'd built his observation device from a butter churn, 2 fence posts, and a mirror. He'd positioned it to look like debris. And through it, he was about to kill 8 men before they knew anyone was watching. The hunter who learned to disappear. Pegahmagabow learned to see without being seen before he learned to read. At 7 years old, he crouched in the October snow near Shawanaga Bay, watching his grandfather track a wounded buck through the birch forests. The old man moved with absolute stillness between movements, explained that deer see motion before they see shapes, that you watch animals by becoming part of the landscape. You don't look at the deer, his grandfather whispered. You look where the deer will be and wait for him to arrive. By 12, Pegahmagabow could identify birds by the patterns of their flight, predict where fish would surface by reading water currents, and remain motionless in a blind for 6 hours waiting for ducks. He learned that observation wasn't about having good eyes. It was about positioning, patience, and understanding what you were watching. He learned that the hunter who moved first usually went home hungry, and the hunter who showed himself against the skyline went home empty-handed. These weren't abstract lessons. His family depended on what he brought back. A missed shot meant less food. A careless movement meant the difference between venison and beans. When he enlisted in the 1st Canadian contingent in August 1914, carrying a Ross rifle that jammed if you looked at it wrong, he brought 20 years of practical knowledge about how to watch things that didn't want to be watched. The butter churn wasn't an innovation. It was just the latest version of a hunting blind, adapted for a landscape where the prey shot back. The death count, nobody prevented. By April 1915, British and Canadian snipers on the Ypres salient were dying at a rate of 3.7 men per day from head wounds sustained during observation. The pattern was grimly predictable. A soldier would raise his head above the parapet to scan no man's land. A German sniper, waiting with infinite patience, would fire. The soldier would drop back into the trench, killed instantly or bleeding from a wound that would kill him within minutes. The body would be wrapped in a ground sheet and carried to the rear. Private Thomas Hewitt, 19 years old, from Medicine Hat, took a round through his left eye on April 3rd while checking for German wire-cutting parties. Corporal James MacDonald, a carpenter from Nova Scotia with 3 children, died on April 9th when he leaned out to observe German trench repairs. Lieutenant Richard Ashworth, who'd been a schoolteacher in Toronto and wrote letters to his students about being brave, was shot through the temple on April 14th while using the Army's brass periscope. The sunlight reflecting off its lenses gave the German sniper a perfect aiming point. The numbers told a story the officers didn't want to hear. Of the 97 observation-related deaths in the Canadian sectors between February and April 1915, 63 involved soldiers using approved brass periscopes. 28 involved soldiers looking over the parapet directly, and 6 involved soldiers using improvised mirrors or other devices. The safest method was forbidden. The approved method was killing 2 men every 3 days. Nobody changed the rules. Pegahmagabow watched them die and knew exactly why it kept happening. The brass periscopes were designed by men who'd never been hunted. They gleamed in sunlight. They had regular shapes that stood out against irregular terrain. They appeared at predictable heights and predictable times. To a trained sniper, they were targets, not tools. But when he suggested an alternative to his platoon commander, he was told to follow regulations. The suggestion that became insubordination. On April 19, 1915, Pegahmagabow approached Lieutenant Gordon Flowerdew in the communication trench behind the Canadian front line at Saint-Julien. He carried a wooden butter churn he'd found in a destroyed Belgian farmhouse, a small mirror wrapped in cloth, and a knife. "Sir," he said, "I can build an observation post that won't get men killed." Flowerdew, a cavalry officer who'd transferred to infantry with deep reluctance, looked at the butter churn with visible contempt. "Corporal, we have approved periscopes issued by ordnance. We use regulation equipment. We don't cobble together farmyard rubbish and pretend it's military technology." Pegahmagabow explained his reasoning. The churn was wood, which didn't reflect light. It was cylindrical and weathered, which made it blend with broken fence posts and debris. Mounted low and angled, it would let a man observe from below the parapet without exposing any part of his body. The mirror inside would show everything in front of the trench while remaining invisible to enemy observers. It was, he explained, exactly how you'd build a hunting blind for watching animals that didn't want to be watched. "The Germans aren't deer, Corporal," Flowerdew said. "And this isn't a hunting expedition. The manual specifically prohibits improvised observation devices. They're unreliable, they create inconsistent fields of view, and they encourage soldiers to take unauthorized initiative. Use the periscope you were issued. That's an order." The conversation ended there, officially. But Pegahmagabow had noticed that Flowerdew hadn't said, "Destroy the butter churn." He'd said, "Use the periscope you were issued." Military regulations left space for interpretation if you were careful enough. Building the invisible eye. At 11:47 p.m. on April 23rd, Pegahmagabow worked in the darkness of the fire bay, 70 yards south of where the communication trench met the front line. The mud was cold enough to sting his hands. He worked by touch, having memorized every step during the previous 3 nights of preparation. First, the mirror. He'd taken a rectangular fragment of glass, roughly 4 inches by 6 inches, from a farmhouse looking glass. Using a file stolen from the engineer's toolkit, he'd ground the edges smooth so they wouldn't catch light. He wrapped the mirror's back in black cloth torn from a burial shroud, leaving only the reflective surface exposed. The cloth prevented any light bleeding through from behind. Second, the churn. He'd selected it for specific reasons. 2 feet tall, 8 inches in diameter, weathered gray-brown wood that matched the color of sandbags. Using his knife, he cut a hole in the bottom, exactly 4 inches by 4 inches, angled at 37 degrees. This wasn't arbitrary. 37 degrees gave him a field of view that covered the entire approach to the Canadian wire while keeping the mirror invisible to anyone observing from ground level. He'd calculated the angle by lying in the mud and measuring sight lines with string. Third, the mount. He lashed the churn to 2 fence posts using wire, positioning it to look like debris propped against the parapet's rear slope. The posts angled forward at 15 degrees, which made the churn lean naturally, as if it had fallen there. He buried the posts 18 inches deep, packing the mud tight so they wouldn't wobble. Wobbling meant movement. Movement meant death. Fourth, the mirror installation. He positioned the mirror inside the churn at precisely the angle he'd calculated, wedging it with cloth so it couldn't shift. The reflection showed him the killing ground, 300 yards of cratered mud, broken wire and morning mist. Perfect. He covered the churn's top with a torn sandbag, making it look like trash. Then he settled into position behind it and waited for dawn. 8 men at 70 yards. At 4:23 a.m., they appeared. 8 German soldiers moving in 2 staggered lines through the mist, approaching the wire at the deliberate pace of men who thought they were unseen. Pegahmagabow watched them through the butter churn, his eye pressed to the viewing hole, his rifle braced against the fire step. 70 yards. 1 man carried wire cutters. Another had a satchel, probably explosives for the Canadian wire. They were a raiding party, hoping to clear an approach route before the main assault at dawn. Standard German tactics. 65 yards. The lead man signaled halt, checking the Canadian parapet for movement. Pegahmagabow remained absolutely still. The butter churn looked like debris. The mirror showed no reflection from this angle. The Germans saw nothing. 60 yards. They advanced again. Pegahmagabow worked the Ross rifle's bolt with infinite slowness, chambering around. The mechanical click was lost in the sound of distant artillery. 55 yards. He could see their faces now through the mirror's reflection. Young men, nervous, trying to move quietly through mud that sucked at their boots. The lead man was perhaps 20. With a thin mustache, he'd probably grown to look older. The man with the wire cutters kept glancing at the Canadian wire, calculating where to cut. He breathed out slowly, steadying his aim. The Ross rifle had a reputation for jamming, but it was accurate at this range if you knew its temperament. He'd fired it enough to understand its quirks. 50 yards. He squeezed the trigger. The lead German dropped. Pegahmagabow worked the bolt, chambered another round, fired. The second man fell. The remaining 6 scattered, looking for the source of fire, seeing nothing. Pegahmagabow fired again. The Ross rifle jammed on the 5th shot, as Ross rifles did, but he'd already killed 4 men. The survivors ran, disappearing into the mist. He cleared the jam, reloaded, and waited. 2 more Germans appeared, trying to retrieve their wounded. He shot them both. Then he grabbed the butter churn, ducked below the parapet, and moved 30 yards south to a different fire bay. When the German sniper returned fire 20 seconds later, shooting at the position where the muzzle flash had been, he was firing at empty mud. Pegahmagabow wrapped the butter churn in a ground sheet and hid it in a drainage sump. The question, without an answer. At 7:15 a.m., Lieutenant Flowerdew arrived at Pegahmagabow's position with a captain from battalion headquarters. The captain's name was Morrison, and he had the careful, suspicious look of a man who'd been sent to investigate something that didn't make sense. "Corporal," Morrison said, "the Germans are reporting sniper fire from this sector that killed 6 men and wounded 2. They're demanding to know what kind of periscope allowed observation of their approach route. Their own snipers saw no reflection, no movement, nothing that indicated observation. How did you see them?" Pegahmagabow looked at Morrison with the blank expression he'd perfected over 8 months of military service. "I used the issued periscope, sir, following regulations. The issued periscope has a limited field of view and produces detectable reflection at dawn," Morrison said. "The Germans were approaching from an angle that shouldn't have been visible using standard observation methods. I'm asking you again, what did you use?" "The issued periscope, sir." Flowerdew intervened. "Captain, the corporal is one of our best scouts. If he says he used regulation equipment, I'm inclined to believe him. The Germans were careless." Pegahmagabow was patient. "Sometimes that's enough." Morrison studied both men, clearly unconvinced. But the bodies were real. The German raid had been stopped, and there was no physical evidence of unauthorized equipment. After a long silence, he said, 6 confirmed kills before breakfast using regulation methods. Remarkable. Carry on, Corporal." After Morrison left, Flowerdew lingered for a moment. He glanced at the drainage sump where the butter churn was hidden, then looked at Pegahmagabow. Neither man said anything. Then Flowerdew turned and walked away. The method nobody authorized. By May 1915, 3 other Canadian snipers had built their own versions of Pegahmagabow's observation device. Private Michael Thompson used a ceramic jug and a razor mirror. Corporal David Sutherland built his from a stovepipe and a fragment of broken window pane. Lance Corporal Robert Mackenzie constructed an elaborate version using a biscuit tin, 2 mirrors, and a periscope arrangement that let him see around corners. The results were identical. Dramatically increased observation time with 0 observation casualties. Thompson watched German wire parties for 11 consecutive hours without being detected, providing intelligence that allowed Canadian artillery to target 3 ammunition dumps. Sutherland identified a German sniper position that had killed 9 Canadian soldiers, leading to a counter-sniper operation that eliminated the threat. Mackenzie's corner viewing device revealed a German trench raid being assembled in a communication trench, giving the Canadians 6 hours warning to prepare an ambush. The Germans noticed. Intelligence reports from captured soldiers mentioned Canadian ghost observers who watched without being seen. German snipers reported that traditional counter-observation tactics, watching for periscope reflection, targeting predictable observation times, no longer worked in Canadian sectors. They couldn't understand how the Canadians were maintaining constant surveillance without casualties. The statistics told the story the official reports wouldn't acknowledge. In February 1915, before Pegahmagabow's butter churn, Canadian observation casualties averaged 3.7 per day. By June 1915, in sectors where improvised observation devices were in use, that number had dropped to 0.4 per day, an 89% reduction. In sectors still using only brass periscopes, casualties remained at 3.6 per day. The evidence was overwhelming. The method worked. Nobody in command officially acknowledged this, the compromise that saved lives. On July 3, 1915, Major General Arthur Curry summoned Pegahmagabow to divisional headquarters in a farmhouse 6 miles behind the lines. Curry was a former real estate salesman who'd become one of Canada's most effective commanders through his willingness to ignore doctrine when doctrine was killing his men. "Corporal," Curry said, "I'm aware you've developed an unauthorized observation method that's reduced casualties to effectively zero in the sectors where it's been implemented. I'm also aware that this method violates 3 separate sections of Infantry Training 1914 and uses materials that aren't part of our logistics chain." Pegahmagabow said nothing. "I can't officially authorize what you're doing," Curry continued, "but I can't ignore results that are keeping my men alive. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to train 20 scouts in your methods. You're going to do this informally, during regular patrol training, in a way that doesn't appear in any official documentation. Those scouts will train others. I will ensure that farmhouses in rear areas contain an adequate supply of butter churns, stovepipes, and broken mirrors." This conversation never happened. Curry pulled out a file containing observation casualty statistics. "Since June, we've had 4 observation-related deaths in sectors using approved equipment and 0 in sectors using your methods. 4 men are alive because you ignored regulations. I'm a general who supposedly enforces those regulations. We're going to keep ignoring them together, quietly, until someone in London realizes that their manual is killing soldiers. It was the most Canadian form of military innovation. Achieve dramatic results, document nothing. Tell London about it only when they couldn't ignore it anymore." The legacy nobody acknowledged. Francis Pegahmagabow survived the First World War with 378 confirmed kills, making him the most effective sniper in the British Empire. He received the military medal 3 times, but never an officer's commission. Indigenous soldiers weren't promoted to command white troops, no matter how capable. He returned to the Parry Island Reserve in 1919, worked as a fishing guide, and died in 1952 at the age of 61. His observation methods became official British Army doctrine in 1917, 2 years after he invented them, codified in the manual Sniping, Scouting and Observation. The manual described improvised observation devices constructed from non-reflective materials including wooden containers, ceramic vessels, and salvaged mirrors. It didn't mention who'd invented them. The British Army credited the development to field expedients by various units, and provided no individual attribution. By 1918, every British, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand sniper section carried improvised observation devices as standard equipment. The brass periscopes that had killed hundreds of men were relegated to training use only. Observation casualties across the Western Front dropped by 73% between 1915 and 1918, saving an estimated 4,600 lives. Pegahmagabow received no recognition for this contribution during his lifetime. The innovation was absorbed into military practice the way water seeps into sand, completely, invisibly, with no marker of where it entered. The men who wrote the 1917 manual never asked who'd built the first butter churn periscope. They simply observed that it worked and made it official. In 2003, the Canadian government designated Pegahmagabow a person of national historic significance. The citation mentioned his service as a sniper and scout. It didn't mention the butter churn because nobody in the Canadian War Museum's research department knew it had existed. The innovation had outlived not just recognition, but memory.